A common question I often get is,
do you like this sweater?
have political parties become too polarized?
Shame on you for even asking that question.
A lot of my professional work and interest has focused on dialogue across divides, especially in this era of increasing polarization. And as anyone knows me also knows, I'm a bit of a political nerd.
Total babe in the political woods.
So it should come as no surprise that I work in lots of contexts where I'm facilitating dialogue across polarized difference, or teaching people how to be more conflict resilient across a polarized divide.
Cats, but everybody said that it was too political, so.
In fact, I'm currently working with senior staff in the United States House of Representatives to address negotiation skills across these divides.
I hope you know that I don't stand for dirty politics, Moira.
In this video, I discuss what I mean by political polarization, how polarization impacts the political parties, and how these changes lead me to conclude that the answer to the question of whether parties are too polarized is a decided yes.
That's why you called me in here?
Yeah.
I'll also share some tips on how you can help change this troubling dynamic for the benefit of our democracy and help us return to a more healthy policy debate between the political parties.
If we look to have given up on ourselves, how can we assure our constituents that we haven't given up on them as well?
I'm Bob Bordone. I'm a senior fellow at Harvard Law School and also the founder and former director of the Harvard Negotiation and Mediation Clinical Program. In addition, I am a co-founder and principal of the Cambridge Negotiation Institute, and I write extensively on conflict resilience, dialogue, and polarization.
I've been in politics for 18 years.
So, when I speak of political polarization, I mean the tendency of those on opposing sides of political issues to move toward the fringes or extremes of their party in ways that seem to widen the gap between these sides and that make finding middle ground or areas of common agreement more difficult.
To change people's misguided and ignorant perceptions.
Over the past 20 years or so, polarization of political parties has accelerated at warp speed.
Given today's political climate, we don't need to divide ourselves any more than we already have.
These trends began in the late 1990s and have accelerated in recent years, particularly with the presidential elections of 2016 and 2020. So what is the evidence of this move to polarization? Well, through much of what has been often called the post-war era in American history, so from 1945 to 1989, there was a large center consensus on many of the governing and policy issues facing the United States. The Cold War threat from the Soviet Union and a vibrant and growing economy contributed to this dynamic. Now, to be clear, that's not to say there weren't serious differences between the way that the Democratic and Republican parties both thought about the role of government and the policy implications of those very different political ideologies or philosophies. Because there were differences and there always have been. But during this era, there nonetheless existed a strong consensus between parties that enabled major bipartisan legislation to pass on a relatively regular basis. Indeed, some of the most liberal and conservative senators would regularly come together and unify on key issues. So the liberal lion of the Senate, Massachusetts Ted Kennedy, would often partner with Utah conservative Orrin Hatch. On issues of foreign policy, it was rare for a senator from an opposing party to criticize the actions of an American president of the opposing party, particularly during a moment of crisis in international affairs.
I'm sure your fancy dinner parties didn't have illegal substances.
Nowadays, though, imagine a union of Massachusetts liberal like Senator Elizabeth Warren with Utah conservative Senator Mike Lee. That would be virtually unheard of. And in foreign policy, there is virtually no deference given to an American president from members of the opposing party, no matter how extreme the crisis. The increasing polarization of the political parties can be explained in a variety of ways. For decades, political candidates from the Democratic and Republican Party would first have to win their party primary in order to get the nomination from their party for the general election. Because the people who are most involved in party politics are often those with the most extreme and polarized views, during a primary campaign, it would not be uncommon to have the candidates pandering to these party loyalists.
You guys treat yourself, okay? Buy yourself something nice.
Those who are most committed to the ideological extremes of their party. But then, Once they received their party's nomination, these candidates would veer toward the center in order to win enough votes from moderates and independents and to win the general election. But beginning in the early 2000s and accelerating in 2016 and beyond, a number of shifts in the political ecosystem changed this, making parties more extreme and more polarized. First, in both the Democratic and Republican parties, those on the far left and the far right respectively started to make the case that rather than pivot to the middle to win votes from what they argued was a shrinking and uncommitted centrist position, it made more sense to work hard to mobilize the vote of those in their own camp who often sat out elections. So on the Republican side, for example, Donald Trump was able to mobilize votes from rural and non-college educated whites who typically sat out elections. And in 2020, Democrats worked hard to mobilize people of color in cities like Detroit and Philadelphia who also typically didn't show up to vote. Within both parties, there is now a lively debate about whether party nominees should work to appeal to the middle-of-the-road swing voter or just redouble their efforts to improve turnout of their base. Debates like these received little traction when I followed politics as a political nerd kid in the 80s and the 90s.
Amateurs.
Second, and related to the above, gerrymandering of congressional districts has played an enormous role in increasing partisanship. So, what is gerrymandering? Well, every decade, the US Constitution requires a census to be taken. And that census determines how many congresspersons each state will receive in the House of Representatives. But then each state has to draw up a map of each congressional district. In many, though not all of the states, this drawing up of the map is left to state legislatures. And the folks in these legislatures often carve up the state in a way to preserve solidly Republican and solidly Democratic districts.
I know someone here wants in on this exclusive opportunity.
The political parties would rather know that of the, let's say, 9 seats that they will have in the House, that 5 would be solidly Republican and 4 would be solidly Democrat. That's much better from their perspective than having 3 solidly Republican, 2 solidly Democrat, and 4 that are, quote, up for grabs. The problem with gerrymandering is as follows. If a district is drawn in such a way that there's literally no chance a Republican could ever win against any Democrat, then the primary election becomes the de facto regular or general election. And as we said above, we know what happens in primary elections. Candidates pander to the extremes of their parties.
What? There's no fundraiser? You're just here to celebrate me?
So now, once nominated, the candidate knows that they will win the general election. So they don't need to worry about shifting to the center at all. But you know what they do need to worry about? They need to worry about a primary challenger who will be even more partisan and more extreme than they.
I am the face of the company.
And so they're constantly guarding, not against the middle-of-the-roader from the other party, but rather against someone who will run on a more extreme version of their own party's platform. We see this dynamic playing out in US politics. I will give you a real example from my own congressional district in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is a very liberal part of the country. In 2018, my then congressman, Mike Capuano, a 10-term, very liberal incumbent with a lot of seniority in the House, was challenged by an even farther to the left primary challenger, AYANNA PRESLEY. Capuano lost in the primary, and PRESLEY is now my congresswoman. There was literally no Republican who could beat her. And the same is true today. So if she has to worry about guarding her left flank, she never has to worry about a challenge from the middle or right flank. And this dynamic has increased the polarization of political parties. Okay, you might be saying, this makes sense for the House of Representatives, but what about the Senate, where each state gets 2 senators and you are not redrawing the map of the state?
I've been gutted!
So you'd be right to say that polarization is somewhat less extreme in the Senate, but you would be wrong to say that it hasn't increased there as well. Well, why is that the case? Well, that's partially because during this entire 30-year period, there have been demographic changes that have resulted in more partisan purity even within the states. So, for example, states like New Hampshire have become more reliably blue, and others like Ohio have become more reliably red. There are still quote-unquote purple states to be sure, but in general, demographic trends have promoted more political polarization within the parties.
A toast!
A toast!
So I hope I've made the case that parties have become more polarized in the past several decades. But have they become too polarized? So the answer here is yes.
Okay.
Okay.
And how do we know that? Well, if we look at American views on issues from common sense gun control legislation to immigration reform to infrastructure and to abortion, there are sizable majorities in favor of all of these things. And yet our Congress is incapable of enacting legislation on virtually any of them. Indeed, Americans of all stripes have favored spending on basic infrastructure, roads, bridges, airports, and the like. And yet only a heroic and historic effort was able to get this legislation through Congress. And it was celebrated as if something truly amazing had happened. Because political parties are more polarized and extreme than most Americans are, something is just wrong here. And this explains so much of the gridlock in Congress. Why things that many people would actually support if asked actually get nowhere when it comes to legislation. And so this leads to another question. What can you do about it? So let me offer you a few ideas. First, get involved in politics. So that can mean literally just getting engaged on a campaign or with a local Republican or Democratic party and trying to work from the inside. But it could mean something less than that, like just learning more about the issues and the candidates. Because the more the candidates have to take an average American seriously, the harder it is for them to just cow to the extreme activists in their party.
You know what I think?
So second, resist the urge to believe that just because Congress is in gridlock and just because our party politics are polarized, that we as Americans are necessarily polarized. There are lots of ways to resist this urge. One is to continue to read the research that doesn't make nightly news, but that shows that there is large convergence on many of the hottest issues in our politics, from climate change to immigration.
You learn pretty quickly when you're in a Ugandan diamond smuggler's villa playing for your friend's freedom.
Right.
But secondly, work hard to engage in dialogue and conversation across lines of political difference. This will take some work because we are more and more geographically divided, and because it is easier and easier to avoid those with whom we disagree. We can just shut ourselves in our own cocoons of comfort. But if you take the effort to look for people with views other than your own, and if you find ways to enter into dialogue with these people, you end up learning that, yeah, like you actually have differences, but no, they are actually not the evil monsters that you might think they were. And that actually there's a lot on which we can agree. The more we believe and act on that, the more the parties will be forced to abandon polarized views and work toward the common good.
She basically forced me into it.
If you are interested in learning more about my own work on polarization or in learning skills that will help you engage in dialogue across difference, please visit me at bobbordone.com or sign up for some of the classes that I teach at the Cambridge Negotiation Institute. Lastly, to keep learning, just check out the next video.